My name is Joanna Miles. I'm 26. And if there's one thing I've learned about my family, it's this. Image comes first, truth comes last. And I'm always the one who pays the price for that order. I wasn't surprised when people laughed at me. I grew up with it. The raised eyebrows, the sighs, the looks that said, try harder to be like everyone else. But nothing prepared me for the moment. A man who barely knew me, my sister's new boyfriend, leaned back in his chair during a family dinner and asked if I was still unemployed, like it was the punchline of a joke he'd been waiting to tell. Everyone laughed. My dad even nodded like he agreed. And for a moment, I almost let it slide. I almost swallowed it the way I always had. But the thing about humiliation is sometimes it hits you exactly when you're done pretending you don't feel it. And sometimes the person who thinks he knows everything accidentally says one that exposes more about himself than he ever meant to. Because while he kept talking, acting like he understood the world better than I ever would, he mentioned something that didn't fit. Something that made me stop breathing for half a second. Something he should have never said in front of me. I didn't call him out that night. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just watched him talk. I let everyone enjoy their laugh. I waited quietly until the moment his own words would circle back to him. And when they finally did, their faces turned pale before I tell you what he said and what happened after I walked out. Tell me, what time is it for you right now? And where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. The dinner took place on a quiet Sunday evening. I drove back to my parents' house with the familiar tightness in my chest, the kind that always surfaced whenever I crossed into their neighborhood. Their street looked exactly the same as when I left for college. Trimmed lawns, matching mailboxes, houses pretending nothing unpleasant ever happened behind the doors. The illusion was intact, polished, rigid. I parked, took a breath, and stepped inside. My mother stood by the kitchen island, arranging plates like she was setting up a showroom rather than a family meal. She greeted me with a smile that felt more like a checklist being completed. She didn't ask how I'd been. She asked why I was cutting it close, as if arriving a few minutes before dinner signaled some deeper personal flaw. I'd grown used to comments that hovered between polite and critical, but they always landed in the same place. My presence was tolerated, never welcomed. My father sat at the table reading through a stack of mail, barely glancing up. He acknowledged me with a nod, the bare minimum effort to avoid being rude. There was no warmth, no hint that he was glad I was there. I took my seat quietly, as I always did. A few minutes later, my sister walked in wearing a polished smile, followed closely by her boyfriend, Evan Carter, the man who had turned their world into a stage set for his charm. It was the first time I'd seen him in a full family setting. He moved with a confidence that bordered on performance, like he was auditioning for a role he already knew he would land. My parents lit up the moment he entered, their postures straightening, their expressions brightening. I didn't need anyone to spell it out. He was exactly the kind of person they wanted to claim as part of the family. We sat down and the conversation flowed around me more than with me. I listened as my mother asked Evan about his week, laughing too loudly at his bland stories. My father encouraged him to share more about his work, nodding along like he understood every detail. My sister beamed, pleased that the spotlight naturally settled on Evan without any effort. They were all participating in a play I didn't know the script for, and I had no interest in auditioning. I kept my head down and focused on eating, but the atmosphere was impossible to ignore. My mother occasionally glanced at me as if checking whether I planned to contribute something impressive. My father seemed relieved every time I remained silent. The dynamic wasn't new, but it felt sharper that night, as if everyone had agreed beforehand that I shouldn't disrupt the perfect picture. It didn't take long for the table's attention to shift toward me anyway. It always did. It wasn't curiosity, it was tradition. Snorts, my family had a way of inspecting me under the guise of conversation, searching for updates that confirmed their assumptions. They measured progress in the simplest terms: job titles, promotions, salaries, milestones they could mention at social gatherings. Anything that didn't fit that mold was considered a step backward. So when the moment came, it came quietly but predictably. Evan turned toward me with a look I'd seen on countless people who thought they understood me after 2 minutes of observation. He asked casually about my work. His tone light, almost friendly, but beneath it was something else, a calculation, an expectation that I would provide an answer that reinforced whatever story he had already crafted in his mind. I answered simply, offering nothing extra, and watched his expression change in subtle ways. My mother shifted in her seat, and my father's jaw tensed. They didn't say anything, but the silence was enough to underline their discomfort. My sister avoided eye contact, busying herself with her fork. The air grew heavier, not because of what I said, but because of what they imagined it meant. Evan took the shift in mood as an opportunity. He leaned back slightly, studying me with an ease that felt practiced. He began talking about his latest projects, his work, his connections, weaving it all together in a way that positioned him as someone impressive, accomplished, enviable. My family listened eagerly, absorbing every detail as if each word confirmed that he was everything they wanted. I sat still watching, listening, waiting. Nothing dramatic happened that moment. No raised voices, no arguments, no confrontation. But the way he spoke, the specific terms he used, the organizations he mentioned in passing, something about it snagged my attention. Not enough to react on the spot, but enough to leave a mark. And by the time dessert was served, I already knew I wouldn't forget it. The mood shifted as the evening grew quieter. It happened in a way that felt almost rehearsed, as if the night had finally reached the scene everyone else had been waiting for. Conversation drifted, plates emptied, and the laughter around the table softened into a warm background hum. That was when Evan leaned forward slightly, scanning the room with the satisfied ease of someone ready to take center stage again. I recognized the rhythm. He had been building toward it all night. He made a comment about ambition, vague enough to sound harmless, pointed enough to land exactly where he intended. It was wrapped in a light tone, but the meaning beneath it was sharp. My mother laughed first, quick and polite. The kind of laugh she used when she wanted to encourage a certain direction. My father chuckled in agreement. My sister gave a restrained smile that didn't reach her eyes. The next remark came smoother, more direct. Evan mentioned people who float between projects, people who take their time finding purpose, people who don't really have jobs yet, but talk like they do. The table laughed again, louder this time. I felt every sound hit me with a familiar sting. Mockery disguised as bonding. Amusement built on the assumption that I wouldn't push back. I didn't respond. Not yet. Silence had always been my shield, the thing that kept me from feeding into their expectations. Then Evan turned to me fully. He didn't need to say my name. The implication was clear before the words even formed. He asked if I still had free time during the day, a gentle phrase that carried the weight of a label I'd heard more than once, unemployed. It was casual enough that he could deny any intention, but obvious enough that my parents exchanged knowing looks. My mother sighed, a small, controlled exhale that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment. My father rested his hand on his glass, swirling it slowly as if preparing to deliver a mild lecture. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the predictable pattern unfolding in front of me. It always happened this way. Someone implied something. Everyone laughed, and the responsibility for ruining the mood fell on me if I reacted. It was an old script, one we'd performed too many times for it to be accidental. Evan continued talking, expanding on the idea of stability, success, work ethic. He spoke like a lecturer addressing a room of eager students. My family listened with genuine admiration, each nod reinforcing the version of him they wanted to believe in. My sister watched him as if he were the embodiment of everything she'd hoped to introduce to the family. I watched him with a different awareness, the awareness that something in his polished narrative wasn't aligning. As he shifted into describing his job in more detail, I caught the first irregularity. It was small, almost imperceptible, the kind of detail most people would overlook. He mentioned a specific type of analytical review, one that didn't quite match the department he claimed to work in. It struck me as odd, but not enough to trigger a reaction. I filed it away quietly. My mother reacted to another one of his statements with a proud smile, commenting that some people at the table could learn from that mindset. My father murmured agreement. The implication wasn't subtle. It was the same message delivered 1,000 different ways throughout my life. Contribute more, achieve more, be more presentable. I stayed silent, not out of weakness, but because silence allowed me to study every detail without drawing attention. Snorts, Evan's confidence grew with each passing minute. He talked about strategies, responsibilities, meetings with executives. He layered his stories with jargon and vague references, enough to impress anyone who didn't understand the terms. But something about his explanations felt too smooth, too curated, like he had memorized pieces from different sources and stitched them into a persona he wanted others to see. I didn't call him out, didn't question anything. I simply listened, observed, memorized. By the time dessert was served, the table was fully committed to the illusion of Evan's success, his intelligence, his stability. But beneath the surface of his words, I recognized a pattern. Details that didn't align, descriptions that contradicted the earlier ones, claims that felt strangely empty. I didn't know exactly what was wrong yet, but I knew one thing. His story wasn't as airtight as he wanted everyone to believe, and that quiet realization changed everything. The days that followed moved with an unusual heaviness. I returned home after the dinner, feeling drained in a way that didn't fade overnight. It was an exhaustion. It was a mental residue left behind from being pushed into a familiar role. The one where I was expected to absorb the laughter, the judgment, the subtle ways my family measured worth. Yet this time something lingered beneath the surface, something sharper than embarrassment or frustration. It was curiosity, the kind that doesn't go away once it settles in. The first inconsistency I noticed during dinner replayed itself in my mind the next morning, looping quietly while I made coffee. Evan had described responsibilities that didn't exist in the department he claimed to work in, at least not in the structure I knew from my own experience in consulting circles. At first, I wondered if he'd simply exaggerated to impress my parents, but the more I thought about it, the more the pieces refused to fit. Still, suspicion alone wasn't enough to pursue anything. People embellish all the time. It wasn't unusual, but the certainty with which he talked, the performative precision, the broad statements reinforced with vague terminology felt too deliberate. It nudged something in me, a sense that I hadn't been shown the full picture. A quiet afternoon arrived, and with it, space to think clearly. I sat on my couch, laptop closed, phone silent, replaying every detail I could remember from dinner. The way my mother leaned in when Evan spoke, the admiration in my father's nod, the way my sister's posture changed whenever he described his accomplishments, and woven into all of it was the contrast. Their complete dismissal of me the moment Evan painted me as someone drifting without direction. That part shouldn't have mattered. I had long stopped seeking validation from them. But it wasn't their reaction that stayed with me. It was how confident Evan felt delivering a narrative that shifted the room instantly. A narrative he supported with statements that didn't align with what he claimed to be. So, I started with the simplest step, research. I didn't dive into anything deep or invasive at first. Instead, I looked for public information. Basic employment records, company structure, leadership names, published projects. Nothing was out of bounds. Everything was available to anyone willing to look. And ironically, the information I found didn't immediately confirm anything wrong. On paper, everything matched the image Evan presented. But the details he used during dinner didn't appear anywhere. Not in job descriptions, not in team structures, not in the summaries of ongoing initiatives. They were pieces that existed in different roles, different divisions, different offices entirely. Even, snorts, then, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he worked on cross-functional assignments. Maybe he had responsibilities not listed publicly. Maybe he embellished a little but still stayed within the realm of truth. Yet the more I examined it, the more the gaps widened. A day later, I reached out to someone I knew from a previous contract. I didn't mention names. I didn't describe situations. I only asked a general question about workflow in that company's analytics wing. The answer came back quickly, clear, detailed, and completely incompatible with the story Evan had shared at dinner. That was when my curiosity sharpened into something else. Resolve. I didn't know what I was looking for yet, but I knew where to start. Patterns don't reveal themselves in a single glance. They reveal themselves piece by piece through inconsistencies that echo louder the more you notice them. Evan's stories had too many polished edges, too many phrases that sounded learned rather than lived, too many claims that shifted depending on the angle he presented them from. I spent the next evening reviewing everything with fresh focus. This wasn't paranoia. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't a reaction to the insults he'd thrown at me. It was instinct. The same instinct that had guided me through complex analysis work. The instinct that noticed when something didn't add up, even if the discrepancy seemed minor. By the time the sun set, I felt something click quietly inside me. Evan wasn't just someone who exaggerated. He was someone who performed. And when performers rely on scripts, the truth always reveals itself the moment they step off the stage. I didn't confront anyone. Not my family, not my sister, and certainly not Evan. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I didn't hint at anything. I simply allowed the questions to guide my next steps, knowing that the answers would come if I followed the inconsistencies to their source. And even though I didn't realize it, then everything that followed began with that single decision to look closer. The next step came quietly, almost without planning. It started with a simple message to Alex Nguyen, someone I had once collaborated with during a contracting assignment. Alex was the kind of person who remembered small details, the kind who could track down information without leaving traces. He wasn't a close friend, but he respected my work and trusted my judgment. When I asked if he had time to look into something, he didn't ask why. He only asked what I needed. I didn't give him Evan's full story. I didn't mention my family, the dinner, or the insults. I kept it professional, just a name, a company, and a few vague questions about employment records. Alex agreed to check, said it might take a day or two, and that was enough. I closed my phone afterward, and forced myself to step away from the situation, at least for a moment. But distance didn't quiet the thoughts. I found myself going back through everything I'd observed recently. There was a rhythm to Evan's behavior. He presented himself as someone important, someone whose presence automatically demanded respect. People responded to that confidence, my family included. The more I studied him, the clearer it became that he wasn't just maintaining an image, he was protecting it. The polished confidence, the curated stories, the seamless way he redirected questions, all pointed to someone who had rehearsed every version of himself before revealing it to others. The idea didn't make me angry. It made me focused. Late that evening, Alex sent a message saying he had found something unusual in public filings. Not illegal, not alarming, just strange. Evan's name appeared on paperwork linked to a small consulting entity registered out of a virtual office suite. The company had no website, no staff listings, no project history. It existed on paper and nowhere else. The discovery didn't surprise me, but it deepened my curiosity. People register small LLCs all the time. But when someone boasts about high responsibilities at a major firm while quietly attaching their name to a shell company with no activity, it raises questions about their intentions. It hinted at parallel work they didn't want tied to their main profile. I asked Alex to look deeper. He didn't hesitate. While waiting for his findings, I continued my own research. I searched for presentations Evan claimed to have given, conferences he said he attended, publications he referenced. None of it appeared anywhere, not even in the scattered corners of the internet where niche professional talks are usually archived. Every claim looked clean on the surface but empty underneath, like a storefront with no inventory. The more I looked, the more the inconsistencies stacked on top of each other. The following day, Alex sent a longer update. He had managed to trace small transactions linked to the shell company, irregular deposits spaced across several months. The snorts amounts varied, but they all appeared to come from personal accounts under different names. There was no indication of legitimate business activity, no invoices, no vendor listings, no corporate contracts. It resembled something informal, something built on promises rather than product. And suddenly, the memory of Evan describing private investor engagements during dinner made sense in a way I wished it didn't. He wasn't collaborating with anyone. He was collecting quietly from people who likely trusted him because he sounded knowledgeable enough to believe. I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't assume criminal intent, but the pattern was clear. Evan wasn't the person he portrayed, and his professional identity leaned more on performance than actual work. That realization didn't bring satisfaction. It didn't feel like vindication. It felt like clarity, cold, steady clarity that settled somewhere deep inside my chest. I didn't tell my family. They wouldn't have listened. Not without undeniable proof. My mother would have dismissed it as speculation. My father would have told me to stay out of it. My sister would have defended Evan because protecting the image mattered more than examining the truth. So, I kept everything to myself. I reviewed every document Alex sent. I rewound every memory from that dinner. I pieced together every detail that hadn't made sense at the time, but now formed a coherent pattern. It wasn't just exaggeration. It wasn't harmless embellishment. It was fabrication layered carefully over truth, polished until even he believed his own narrative. By the time I closed my laptop that night, one thing was certain. Whatever Evan was building behind the scenes, it wasn't stable. It wasn't sustainable, and it wasn't harmless. And whether my family wanted to face it or not, the truth was going to surface one way or another. The wedding invitation arrived sooner than I expected. A cream envelope with gold lettering appeared in my mailbox, carefully addressed as if formality could disguise everything underneath. I opened it without hesitation. My sister's name was printed across the top in elegant script paired with Evan's in a matching font. The card listed a date, a venue, and a request for guests to attend a celebration of new beginnings. I stared at it longer than necessary, not out of sentiment, but out of a quiet awareness of what the event would become. The next day, I submitted my RSVP online. I marked attending, closed my laptop, and let the confirmation email sit unread. It wasn't an emotional decision. It wasn't driven by spite or a desire to disrupt anything. It was practical. If there was going to be a moment when all the pieces converged, it would be there. At the place where appearances mattered most to my family, silence followed. My parents didn't reach out to ask if I planned to come. My sister didn't text to share excitement or logistical questions. They all moved forward with their lives as if the dinner never happened, as if the distance between us was something natural rather than the result of choices made at that table. I didn't mind the quiet. It gave me space to think, to observe, to plan. A few days later, a message from Alex Nguyen appeared on my phone. He had found something new in the records, something that shifted the situation from suspicious to serious. I opened the file he sent, scrolling through transaction lists, timestamps, and spreadsheets he had reorganized for clarity. The deposits into Evan's shell company weren't random. They formed a pattern when arranged chronologically. The amounts increased gradually, then spiked, then leveled off. They resembled staged rounds of personal fundraising rather than income from legitimate work. The more alarming part came next. Alex had traced 2 of the incoming payments back to individuals who had filed small claims disputes in the past for unreturned investments. Nothing major, nothing publicly tied to Evan, but enough to show a connection between his private activity and disgruntled participants. Snorts, it wasn't definitive evidence of wrongdoing, but it suggested a structure built on promises rather than outcomes. I sat still after reading the file, absorbing each detail with a calm focus that surprised even me. It wasn't just about exposing him anymore. It wasn't even about protecting my family from embarrassment, a concern I had long stopped carrying. It was about recognizing the harm he was capable of causing if no one intervened. A week before the wedding, the venue sent out a mass email reminding guests about the schedule. My sister forwarded it to the family group chat, adding a short message about dress code and parking instructions. I responded with a simple acknowledgement. She reacted with a thumbs up emoji, nothing more. It was the most contact we'd had since the dinner. On the day of the rehearsal dinner, I received another file from Alex. This one contained something different. Screenshots from an online forum where users discussed private investment opportunities. A profile that matched Evan's writing style appeared repeatedly promoting a project described with buzzwords but lacking transparent documentation. Some users praised him. Others questioned the legitimacy of his claims. One mentioned losing a significant amount of money. The post dated back nearly 2 years. That was enough. Not enough for authorities to act. Not enough to accuse him publicly without context. But enough for me to understand the scale of what he was attempting to build and the danger my sister would be stepping into by tying her life to his. I didn't make a plan in the traditional sense. There were no long rehearsals, no dramatic build-up, no rehearsed monologue. I simply gathered everything. Every document, every inconsistency, every piece of information Alex uncovered and stored it in a single folder. Facts didn't need embellishment. They only needed the right moment. The wedding provided that moment. I placed the folder on my desk that evening, organized and ready. I didn't feel heroic, anxious, or vindictive. I felt steady, grounded by the understanding that truth doesn't require theatrics. It only requires timing. And when that timing arrived, I intended to be prepared. The wedding morning arrived with an odd stillness. I drove to the venue without urgency, following the long road toward the vineyard where the ceremony would take place. The sky hung low, a muted gray that didn't match the festive decorations lining the path. Snorts, guests moved in coordinated clusters, adjusting suits, smoothing dresses, laughing lightly. I walked alone, carrying nothing but a small clutch with the folder inside. It wasn't heavy, but its presence grounded me. The ceremony began without delay. My sister walked down the aisle looking radiant, hopeful, unaware. Evan stood waiting with practiced confidence, wearing a smile that seemed carved into place. Applause rose as she reached him. Vows were exchanged. Rings slipped into place. Cameras flashed. Everything unfolded smoothly, flawlessly, like a performance designed for a highlight reel. Then came the reception. Tables filled, glasses clinked, conversations overlapped. My parents floated through the room, greeting guests, beaming with pride. My sister and Evan made their entrance, receiving congratulations from every direction. They looked like the perfect couple, the perfect success story. And maybe that was why the timing felt right, because illusions are most vulnerable when people believe in them the most. I waited until the speeches were finished and guests began drifting toward the buffet. I walked toward the newly married couple with steady steps, not hurried, not hesitant. My sister saw me first. She looked surprised, almost relieved, as if my presence meant something good. Evan noticed only when I stopped in front of him. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't create a scene. I simply opened the folder and held it out. He glanced at the papers, then at me, confusion flashing across his face. My sister leaned in to see what I was showing him. Her expression shifted slowly. First curiosity, then confusion, then a stiffness that spread like frost. Inside the folder were documents Alex had verified, financial patterns, public filings, dispute summaries, forum screenshots. Nothing embellished, nothing speculative, just the truth arranged in clear order. Evan's demeanor cracked immediately. The confidence drained from his posture, replaced by a flicker of panic he couldn't mask. His mouth tightened, his cheeks flushed. He reached for excuses that fell apart before they could form. My sister stepped back slightly, her breathing uneven. Guests around us began noticing the tension, their conversations dimming into cautious murmurs. My parents approached, their expressions shifting from irritation to alarm when they saw the papers. I didn't explain. I didn't accuse. I didn't narrate his actions. I only said one sentence. Calm, steady, undeniable. You should know who you married. The silence that followed was heavier than any confrontation I could have engineered. Evan's reaction did the rest. His defensiveness, his frantic attempts to dismiss the evidence, his failure to provide a coherent explanation. Each response revealed more than the documents themselves. My sister watched him unravel in real time, the polished mask she had fallen in love with collapsing in front of an entire room. My parents reacted exactly as I expected. They blamed me. My mother insisted I was trying to ruin the day. My father said I was making this about myself. Their words carried no surprise. They were echoes of every moment they had dismissed my perspective in favor of whoever stood taller, spoke louder, or projected certainty. I didn't stay to defend myself. I didn't wait for validation or apologies. I stepped away from the cluster forming around the couple, walked past the rows of tables, and headed toward the exit. No one followed me. Not my parents, not my sister, not even Evan, who was too busy scrambling to salvage the image he had constructed. Outside, the air felt lighter. I reached my car, placed the now empty folder on the passenger seat, and sat for a moment, letting the sounds from the reception fade behind me. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel regret. What I felt was clarity. Sharp, clean, long overdue. Cutting ties wasn't dramatic. It wasn't painful. It was necessary. As I drove away, I understood something I had spent years resisting. Sometimes the family you're born into isn't the one that protects you. Sometimes the role they assign you is too small for the person you actually are. And sometimes walking away isn't abandonment, it's self-respect. If you listened to my story all the way through, thank you for giving it your time. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what do you think is harder, speaking up or finally walking away?